All right, let's get right into it. Today, we're breaking down a pretty provocative article from Zero Hedge. It dives into a massive fraud case out of Minnesota, but it doesn't stop there. The article presents a really controversial theory about the political machine it claims is behind the whole thing. $250 million. Just let that number sink in for a second. According to federal prosecutors, that's how much money was allegedly stolen in just one single fraud scheme that happened during the COVID era. And this huge number is really the jumping-off point for the source we're looking at today. So the whole thing centered on this Minnesota nonprofit called Feeding Our Future. They were supposed to be using federal funds to provide meals for kids who needed them. But as the article points out, this whole thing raises a very pointed question. And that question right there, that's the absolute core of the article's entire argument. It suggests that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't just a bunch of people getting greedy. It proposes that this $250 million fraud could have been the intended outcome of a political strategy that was put into place years and years ago. So first things first, let's dig into the details of the fraud itself, at least as the article lays them out for us. According to the source, the way it worked was actually pretty simple on the surface. You had shell companies and nonprofits that were just creating invoices for literally thousands of meals that were never served to kids who didn't even exist. The article makes a point to say that while 70 people have been charged in this specific case, the FBI is looking into whether the total fraud across all similar programs could actually be more like $2 billion. And that scale brings us to the article's main thesis, which it calls the architect theory. The author basically argues that if you really want to understand a crime this big, you can't just look at the people who got caught. You have to look higher up. The article uses this exact quote to frame its entire argument. It's a pivot, right? It shifts the focus away from the individuals who were cashing the fraudulent checks and points the finger instead at the policies of the Obama administration, which it claims built the bank that made the whole theft possible in the first place. To back this up, the article brings in a concept it labels demographic engineering. It defines this as a deliberate policy of settling specific refugee populations, in this instance Somalis, into key states with the goal of creating a dependable voting bloc that relies on government programs. So this slide lays out the timeline that the author presents. The article says that during the Obama years, more than 54,000 Somali refugees were brought into the U.S., with a real focus on Minnesota. The result, according to this source, was the creation of a concentrated community that it calls an insular enclave and a captured constituency. Now, you might be asking yourself, how could a fraud this massive go on for so long? Well, the article has another key argument for that, which it frames as equity as a shield. The claim here is that the normal government oversight was basically neutered on purpose. The article describes this really specific cycle. It alleges that when state officials started getting suspicious and tried to hit the brakes on the payments, the organizers of Feeding Our Future immediately sued them for racial discrimination. The source then argues that the state officials, terrified of being called racist, caved, turned the money spigot back on, and let the fraud keep rolling. And this quote from the source, wow, it really gets to the heart of its argument. The idea is that the fear of lawsuits and being publicly shamed for racism was weaponized to completely paralyze the regulators who were supposed to be the watchdogs for taxpayer money. From there, the article tries to connect the dots directly from the scandal to some big names in the Democratic Party, which, builds on its theory that this was all a politically motivated operation from the start. Okay, a central piece of this part of the argument focuses on Congresswoman Ilhan Omar and a piece of legislation she sponsored, the Meals Act. Now, the article claims that this act, which got rid of the rule that kids had to physically be there to get a meal, basically removed the main way to prevent fraud. The source calls it a blank check that let the whole scheme just explode. And the article keeps going, listing other alleged connections. It points to campaign donations made to Omar from people who were later indicted. It also points to her husband's firm, which it says once had former Obama officials listed as advisors. The article pulls all this together to suggest what it calls a federally integrated operation. So after all that, what does the article claim is the ultimate cost? It breaks the fallout down into three big categories. You've got financial, you've got security, and of course, you've got political. On the political front, the article claims the strategy was a huge success for the people it calls the architects. It throws this statistic out there, claiming Minnesota's Somali community votes over 80% for the Democratic Party, which it says is the big political payoff for all those resettlement policies. And this slide right here basically summarizes the article's view on the total damage report. Financially, you're talking hundreds of millions gone. In terms of national security, it raises the alarm that some of that stolen money, sent overseas, could have wound up with extremist groups. And politically, it asserts that the whole thing created a captured constituency. Now, the article doesn't just end there. It wraps up with a direct call to action for its readers. It tells them to share this information, to demand audits of government grants, and not to be afraid to ask hard questions about where their tax dollars are going. It ends that section with the phrase, "Keep your eyes on the money." And all of that brings us to the final and probably the most pointed takeaway from this entire article. What's the one big thought it wants to leave hammering in the reader's mind? And there you have it. The article closes with this incredibly provocative statement. It frames this whole scandal as something much bigger than just financial fraud. It's presented as a fundamental betrayal that's tied up in national identity and immigration policy. It's a powerful and definitely controversial conclusion to a story that, from this source's point of view, is about a whole lot more than just stolen money.